John Redding Goes to Sea by Zora Neale Hurston. The villagers said that John Redding was a queer child. His mother thought he was too. She would shake her head sadly and observe to John's father, "Alf, it's too bad our boy's got a spell on him." John's father always met this lament with indifference, if not impatience. "Oh, woman, stop that talk about conjuring. It ain't true anyhow. I don't want John to get that foolishness in him." "That's 'cause you're always trying to know more than me, but I ain't so ignorant. I know a heap myself. Many people have been driven out of their minds by conjuration or ridden to death by witches." "I keep on telling you, woman, it ain't so. Believe it all you want to, but don't you tell my son any of it." Perhaps 10-year-old John was puzzling to the simple folk there in the Florida woods, for he was an imaginative child and fond of daydreams. The St. John River flowed scarce 300 feet from his back door. On its banks at this point grew numerous palms, luxuriant magnolias, and bay trees with a dense undergrowth of ferns, cattails, and rope grass. On the bosom of the stream float millions of delicately colored hyacinths. The little brown boy loved to wander down to the water's edge and, casting in dry twigs, watch them sail away downstream to Jacksonville, the sea, the wide world, and John Redding wanted to follow them. Sometimes in his dreams he was a prince riding away in a gorgeous carriage. Often he was a knight bestride a fiery charger prancing down the white shell road that led to distant lands. At other times he was a steamboat captain piloting his craft down the St. John River to where the sky seemed to touch the water. No matter what he dreamed or who he fancied himself to be, he always ended by riding away to the horizon, for in his childish ignorance he thought this to be the farthest land. But these twigs, which John called his ships, did not always sail away. Sometimes they would be swept in among the weeds growing in the shallow water and be held there. One day his father came upon him scolding the weeds for stopping his sea-going vessels. "Let go of my ships, you mean old weeds, you!" John screamed and stamped impotently. "They want to go away. You let 'em go." Alfred laid his hand on his son's head lovingly. "What's the matter, son?" "My ships, Pa," the child answered, weeping. "I throwed 'em in to go way off and those weeds won't let 'em." Well, don't cry. I thought you were a grown man. Men don't cry like babies. You mustn't take it too hard about your ships. You got to get used to things, getting tied up. There's lots of folks that would go on off too if something didn't catch 'em and hold 'em." Alfred Redding's brown face grew wistful for a moment, and the child, noticing it, asked quickly, "Do weeds tangle up folks too, Pa?" "Now, no, child, don't be taking too much stock of what I say. I talk in parables sometimes. Come on, let's go home to supper." Alf took his son's hand and started slowly toward the house. Soon John broke the silence. "Pa, when I get big as you, I'm going farther than them ships. I'm going to where the sky touches the ground." "Well, son, when I was a boy, I said I was going too, but here I am. I hope you have better luck than me." "Pa, I bet you I seen something in the wood lot you ain't seen." "What?" "See that tallest pine over there? How it looks like a skull with a cross on?" It do look like a skull since you call my attention to it. You imagine lots of things nobody else ever did." "Sometimes, Pa, that old tree waves at me just after the sun goes down and makes me sad and scared, too." "I expect you're scared of the dark, that's all, sonny. Why, you get bigger, you won't even think of such." Hand in hand, the two trudged across the plowed land and up to the house, the child dreaming of the days when he should wander to far countries, and the man of the days when he might have. And thus they entered the kitchen. Mattie Redding, John's mother, was setting the table for supper. She was a small, wiry woman with large eyes that might have been beautiful when she was young, but too much weeping had left them watery and weak. "Mattie, Alf began as he took his place at the table. "Don't you know our boy is different from any other child around here? He allows he's going to sea when he gets grown, and I reckon I'll let him." The woman turned from the stove, skillet in hand. "Alf, you ain't gone crazy, is you? John can't help wanting to stray off 'cause he's got a spell on him, but you ought to be ashamed to be encouraging him. And I done told you 40 times not to talk that low-life mess in front of my boy." "Well, if there ain't no conjure in the world, how come Mitch Potts been lying in his back 6 months and the doctor can't do him no good? Answer me that. The very night John was born, Granny saw old witch Judy Davis creeping out of this yard. You know she had sworn to fix me for marrying you away from her daughter Edna. She put travel dust down for my child. That's what she done to make him walk away from me. And ever since he been able to crawl, he's been trying to go. Mattie, a man don't need no travel dust to make him want to hit the road. It just comes naturally for a man to travel. They all want to go sometime or other, but they can't all get away. I want my John to go and see, because I wanted to go myself. When he comes back, I can see them foreign places with his eyes. He can't help wanting to go, 'cause he's a man-child." Mrs. Redding promptly went off into a fit of weeping, but the man and boy ate supper unmoved. 12 years of married life had taught Alfred that far from being miserable when she wept, his wife was enjoying a bit of self-pity. Thus, John Redding grew to manhood, playing, studying, and dreaming. He attended the village school, as did most of the youth about him, but he also went to high school at the county seat, where none of the villagers went. His father shared his dreams and ambitions, but his mother could not understand why he should wish to go to strange places where neither she nor his father had been. No one in their community had ever been farther away than Jacksonville. Few indeed had even been there. Their own gardens, general store, and occasional trips to the county seat, 7 miles away, sufficed for all their needs. Life was simple indeed for these folk. John was the subject of much discussion among the country folk. Why didn't he teach school instead of thinking about strange places and people? Did he think himself better than any of the gals thereabout that he would not go a-courting any of them? He must be fixed, as his mother claimed, else where did his queer notions come from? Well, he always was queer, and one could not expect the man to be different from the child. They never failed to stop work at the approach of Alfred in order to be at the fence and inquire after John's health and ask when he expected to leave. "Oh," Alfred would answer, "just as soon as his ma gets reconciled to the notion. He's a mighty dutiful boy, my John is. He don't want to hurt her feelings." The boy had on several occasions attempted to reconcile his mother to the notion, but found it a difficult task. Mattie always took refuge in self-pity and tears. Her son's desires were incomprehensible to her. That was all. She did not want to hurt him. It was love, mother love, that made her cling so desperately to John. "Lord knows," she would sigh, "I never was happy and never expect to be." "And from your actions," put in Alfred hotly, "you're determined not to be." "That's right, Alfred. Go on and abuse me, you always does. I know I'm ignorant and all that, but this is my son. I bred and born him. He can't help but want to go roving because travel dust been put down for him, but maybe we can cure him by discouraging the idea." "Well, I wants my son to go, and he wants to go too. He's a man now, Mattie, and we must let John hoe his own row. If it's traveling, it won't be for long. He'll come back to us better than when he went off. What do you say, son?" "Mama," John began slowly, "it hurts me to see you so troubled over my going away, but I feel that I must go. I'm stagnating here. This indolent atmosphere will stifle every bit of imagination that's in me. Let me go, Mama, please. What is there here for me? Why, sometimes I get to feeling just like a lump of dirt turned over by the plow. Just where it falls, that's where it lies. No thought or movement or nothing. I want to make something of myself, not just stay where I was born." "No, John. It's better for you to stay here and take over the school. Why don't you marry and settle down?" "I don't want to, Mama. I want to go away." "Well," said Miss Redding, pursing her mouth tightly, "you ain't going with my consent." "I'm sorry, Mama, that you won't consent. I'm going nevertheless." "John, John, my baby, you wouldn't kill your poor old Mama, would you? Come kiss me, son." The boy flung his arms about his mother and held her closely while she sobbed on his breast. To all of her pleas, however, he answered that he must go. "I'll stay at home this year, Mama. Then I'll go for a while, but it won't be long. I'll come back and make you and Papa oh so happy. Do you agree, Mama?" "I reckon there ain't nothing at all else for me to do." Things went on very well around the Redding home for some time. During the day, John helped his father about the farm and read a great deal at night. Then the unexpected happened. John married Stella Canty, a neighbor's daughter. The courtship was brief, but ardent, on John's part at least. He danced with Stella at a candy pulling, walked with her home, and in 3 weeks had declared himself. Mrs. Redding declared that she was happier than she had ever been in her life. She therefore indulged in a whole afternoon of weeping. John's change was occasioned possibly by the fact that Stella was really beautiful. He was young and red-blooded, and the time was spring. Springtime in Florida is not a matter of peeping violets or bursting buds merely. It is a riot of color in nature, glistening green leaves, pink, blue, purple, yellow blossoms that fairly stagger the visitor from the north. The miles of hyacinths lie like an undulating carpet on the surface of the river and divide reluctantly when the slow-moving alligators push their way, log-like, across. The nights are white nights, for the moon shines with dazzling splendor, or in the absence of that goddess, the soft darkness creeps down laden with innumerable scents. The heavy fragrance of magnolias mingled with the delicate sweetness of jasmine and wild roses. If time and propinquity conquered John, what then? These forces have overcome older men. The raptures of the first few weeks over, John began to saunter out to the gate to gaze wistfully down the white, dusty road, or to wander again to the river as he had done in childhood. To be sure, he did not send forth twig ships any longer, but his thoughts would be, in spite of himself, straight down river to Jacksonville, the sea, the wide world, and poor home-tied John Redding wanted to follow them. He grew silent and pensive. Mattie accounted for this by her ever-ready explanation of conjuration. Alfred said nothing, but smoked and puttered about the barn more than ever. Stella accused her husband of indifference and made his life miserable with tears, accusations, and pouting. At last, John decided to bring matters to a head and broached the subject to his wife. "Stella, dear, I want to go roving about the world for a spell. Would you stay here with Papa and Mama and wait for me to come back?" "John, is you crazy sure enough? If you don't want me, say so and I can go home to my folks." "Stella, darling, I do want you, but I want to go away, too. I can have both if you'll let me. We'll be so happy when I return." "No, John, you can't brush me off to the side like that. You didn't have to marry me. There's plenty of others that would have been glad enough to get me. You knew I wasn't educated beforehand." "Don't make me too conscious of my weakness, Stella. I know I should have never married with my inclinations, but it's done now. No use to talk about what is past. I love you and I want to keep you, but I can't stifle that longing for the open road, rolling seas, for people and country I've never seen. I'm suffering too, Stella. I'm paying for my rashness in marrying before I was ready. I'm not trying to shirk my duty. You'll be well taken care of in the meanwhile." "John, folks always said you were queer and told me not to marry you, but I just loved you so I couldn't help it, and now to think you want to sneak off and leave me." "But I'm coming back, darling. Listen, Stella." But the girl would not. Mattie came in, and Stella fell into her arms weeping. John's mother immediately took up arms against him. The two women carried on such an effective war against him for the next few days that finally Alfred was forced to take his son's part. "Maddie, let that boy alone, I tell you. If he was a homebody, he'd be driven away by you all's racket." "Well, Alf, that's what we poor women can do. We wants our husbands and our sons. John's got a wife now, and he ain't got no business to be talking about going nowhere. I thought that marrying Stella would settle him." "Yes, that's all you women study about, settling some man. You takes all the get up out of him. Just let a fella make a motion like getting somewhere, and some woman'll begin to holler, 'Stop there, what you going? Don't forget you belongs to me.'" "My God, Alf, what you reckon Stella's gonna do? Let John walk off and leave her?" "No, get her out of her foolishness and go along with him. He'd take her." "Stella ain't got no call to go crazy 'cause John is. She ain't no woman to be flopping around from place to place like some of these reps following a section gang." The man turned abruptly from his wife and stood in the kitchen door. A blue haze hung over the river, and Alfred's attention seemed fixed upon this. In reality, his thoughts were turned inward. He was thinking of the numerous occasions upon which he and his son had sat on the fallen log at the edge of the water and talked of John's proposed travels. He had encouraged his son, given him every advantage his own poor circumstances would permit, and now John was home-tied. The young man suddenly turned the corner of the house and approached his father. "Hello, Papa." "Hello, son." "Where's Mama and Stella?" The older man merely jerked his thumb toward the interior of the house and once more gazed pensively toward the river. John entered the kitchen and kissed his mother fondly. "Great news, Mama." "What now?" "Got a chance to join the Navy, Mama, and go all around the world. Ain't that grand?" "John, you surely ain't going to leave me and Stella, is you?" "Yes, I think I am. I know how both of you feel, but I know how I feel also. You preached to me the gospel of self-sacrifice for the happiness of others, but you are unwilling to practice any of it yourself. Stella can stay here. I'm going to support her and spend all the time I can with her. But I'm going. That's settled. But I want to go with your goodwill. I want to do something worthy of a strong man. I've done nothing so far but look to you and Papa for everything. Let me learn to strive and think. In short, be a man." "No, John. I'll never give my consent. I know you's hard-headed just like your pa, but if you leave this place over my head, I'll never want you to come back here no more. If I was laid on the cooling board, I don't want you standing over me, young man. Don't you even come near my grave, you ungrateful wretch." Mrs. Redding rose and flung out of the room. For once, she was too incensed to cry. John stood in his tracks, gone cold and numb at his mother's pronouncement. Alfred, too, was moved. Mrs. Redding banged the bedroom door violently and startled John slightly. Alfred took his son's arm, saying softly, "Come, son, let's go down to the river." At the water's edge, they halted for a short space before setting themselves on the log. The sun was setting in a purple cloud. Hundreds of mosquito hawks darted here and there, catching gnats and being themselves caught by the lightning-swift bull bats. John abstractly snapped in two the stalk of a slender young bamboo. Taking no note of what he was doing, he broke it into short lengths and tossed them singly into the stream. The old man watched him silently for a while, but finally he said, "Oh, yes, my boy. Some ships get tangled in the weeds." "Yeah, Papa, they certainly do. I guess I'm beaten. Might as well surrender." "Never say die. You never can tell what will happen." "What can happen?" "I have courage enough to make things happen, but what can I do against Mama? What man wants to go on a long journey with his mother's curses ringing in his ear? She doesn't understand wait another year, but I am going because I must." Alfred threw an arm about his son's neck and drew him nearer, but quickly removed it. Both men instantly drew apart, ashamed for having been so demonstrative. The father looked off to the woodlot and asked with a reminiscent smile, Son, do you remember showing me the tree that's shaped like a skeleton head? Yes, I do. It's there still. I look at it sometimes when things have become too painful for me at the house, and I run down here to cool off and think. And every time I look at it, Papa, it laughs at me like it had some grim joke up its sleeve. You always was imagining things, John. Things that nobody else ever thought on. You know, Papa, sometimes I reckon my longing to get away makes me feel this way. I feel that I'm just earth, soil, lying helpless to move myself, but thinking. I seem to hear herds of big beasts like horses and cows thundering over me, and rains beating down and winds sweeping furiously over, all acting upon me. But me? Well, just soil, feeling but not able to take part in it all. And then a soft wind like love passes over and warms me, and a summer rain comes down like understanding and softens me, and I push a blade of grass or a flower or maybe a pine tree. And that's the ground thinking. Plants are ground thoughts because the soil can't move itself. Whenever I see little whirls of dust sailing down the road, I always step aside, don't want to stop them because they're on their shining way, moving. Yeah, I'm a dreamer. I have such wonderfully complete dreams, Papa. They never come true. But even as my dreams fade, I have others. Yeah, son. I have them same feelings exactly, but I can't find no words like you do. It seems like you and me see with the same eyes, hear with the same ears, and even feel the same inside. Only thing you can talk it and I can't. But anyhow, you speaks for me, so what's the difference? The men arose without more conversation. Possibly they feared to trust themselves to speech. As they walked leisurely toward the house, Alfred remarked the freshness of the breeze. It's about time the rain set in, added his son. The year's wearing on. After a gloomy supper, John strolled out into the space in the front yard and seated himself beneath a chinaberry tree. The breeze had grown a trifle stronger since sunset and came in from the southeast. Mattie and Stella sat on the deep front porch, but Alfred joined John under the tree. The family was divided into two armed camps, and the hostilities had reached that stage where no quarter could be asked or given. About 9 o'clock, an automobile came flying down the dusty white road and halted at the gate. A white man slammed the gate and hurried up the walk toward the house, but stopped abruptly before the men beneath the chinaberry. It was Mr. Hill, the builder of the new bridge that was to span the river. Howdy, John. Howdy, Alf. I'm mighty glad I found you. I'm in trouble. Well now, Mr. Hill, answered Alfred slowly but pleasantly. We're glad to see you too. What trouble could you be having now? It's the bridge. The Weather Bureau says that the rains be upon me in 48 hours. If it catches the bridge, as it is now, I'm afraid all my work of the past 5 months will be swept away, to say nothing of $250,000 worth of labor and materials. I've got all my men at work now, and I thought to get as many extra hands as I could out tonight and tomorrow. We can make her weather tight in that time if I can get about 20 more. I'll go, Mr. Hill, said John with a great deal of energy. I don't want Papa out on that bridge. It's too dangerous. Good for you, John, cried the white man. Now if I had a few more men of your brawn and brain, I could build an entirely new bridge in 48 hours. Come on and jump into the car. I'm taking the men on down as I find them. Wait a minute. I must put on my blue jeans. I won't be long. John arose and strode to the house. He knew that his mother and wife had overheard everything, but he paused for a moment to speak to them. Mama, I'm going to work all night on the bridge. There was no answer. He turned to his wife. Stella, don't be lonesome. I'll be home at daybreak. His wife was as silent as his mother. John stood for a moment on the steps, then resolutely strode past the women and into the house. A few minutes later he emerged clad in his blue overalls and brogans. This time he said nothing to the silent figures rocking back and forth on the porch. But when he was a few feet from the steps, he called back, Bye, Mama. Bye, Stella, and hurried on down to the walk to where his father sat. So long, Papa. I'll be home at 7. Alfred roused himself and stood. Placing both hands on his son's broad shoulders, he said softly, "Be careful, son. Don't fall or nothing." "I will, Papa. Don't you get into a quarrel on my account." John hurried on to the waiting car and was whirled away. Alfred sat for a long time beneath the tree where his son had left him and smoked on. The women soon went indoors. On the night breeze were borne numerous scents of jasmine, roses, of damp earth, of the river, of the pine forest nearby. A solitary whippoorwill sent forth his plaintive call from the nearby shrubbery. A giant owl roared and boomed from the woodlot. The calf confined in the barn would bleat and be answered by his mother's sympathetic moo from the pen. Away down in Lake Howell Creek, the basso profundo of the alligators boomed and died, boomed and died. Around 10 o'clock the breeze freshened, growing stiffer until midnight when it became a gale. Alfred fastened the doors and bolted the wooden shutters at the windows. The three persons sat about a round table in the kitchen, upon which stood a bulky kerosene lamp, flickering and sputtering in the wind that came in through the numerous cracks in the walls. The wind rushed down the chimney, blowing puffs of ashes about the room. It banged the cooking utensils on the wall. The drinking gourd hanging outside by the door played a weird tattoo, hollow and unearthly, against the thin wooden wall. The man and women sat silently. Even if there had been no storm, they would not have talked. They could not go to bed because the women were afraid to retire during a storm, and the man wished to stay awake and think with his son. Thus they sat, the women hot with resentment toward the man and terrified by the storm, the man hardly mindful of the tempest, but eating his heart out in pity for his boy. Time bore heavily on. And now a new element of terror was added. A screech owl alighted on the roof and shivered forth his doleful cry. Possibly he had been blown out of his nest by the wind. Maddie started up at the sound, but fell back in her chair, pale and trembling. "My God!" she gasped. "That's a sure sign of death." Stella hurriedly thrust her hand into the salt jar and threw some into the chimney of the lamp. The color of the flame changed from yellow to blue-green, but this burning salt did not have the desired effect, to drive away the bird from the roof. Maddie slipped out of her blue calico wrapper and turned it wrong side out before replacing it. Even Alfred turned one sock. "Alf," said Maddie, "what do you reckon's going to happen from this?" "How do I know, Maddie? I wish John hadn't went away from here tonight." Outside the tempest raged. The palms rattled dryly, and the giant pines groaned and sighed in the grip of the wind. Flying leaves and pine masts filled the air. Now and then a brilliant flash of lightning disclosed a bird being blown here and there in the wind. The prodigious roar of the thunder seemed to rock the earth. Black clouds hung so low that the tops of the pines were among them, moving slowly before the wind, and made the darkness awful. The screech owl continued his tremulous cry. After 3 o'clock the wind ceased and the rain commenced. Huge drops clattering down upon the shingle roof like buckshot and ran from the eaves in torrents. It entered the house through the cracks in the walls and under the doors. It was a deluge in volume and force, but subsided before morning. The sun came up brilliantly on the havoc of the wind and rain, calling forth millions of feathered creatures. The white sand everywhere was full of tiny cups dug out by the force of the falling raindrops. The rims of the little depressions crunched noisily underfoot. At daybreak, Mr. Redding set out for the bridge. He was uneasy. On arriving, he found that the river had risen 12 feet during the cloudburst and was still rising. The slow St. John's was swollen far beyond its banks, and rushing on to sea like a mountain stream, sweeping away houses, great blocks of earth, cattle, trees, in short, anything that came within its grasp. Even the steel framework of the new bridge was gone. The siren of the fiber factory was tied down for half an hour, announcing the disaster to the countryside. When Alfred arrived, therefore, he found nearly all the men of the district there. The river, red and swollen, was full of floating debris. Huge trees were swept along as relentlessly as chicken coops and fence rails. Some steel piles were all that was left of the bridge. Alfred went down to a group of men who were fishing members of the ill-fated construction gang out of the water. Many were able to swim ashore unassisted. Wagons backed up and were hurriedly driven away, loaded with shivering, wet men. 2 men had been killed outright, others seriously wounded. 3 men had been drowned. At last all had been accounted for, except John Redding. His father ran here and there, asking for him or calling him. No one knew where he was. No one remembered seeing him since daybreak. Dozens of women had arrived at the scene of the disaster by this time. Maddie and Stella, wrapped in woolen shawls, were among them. They rushed to Alfred in alarm and asked where John was. "I don't know," answered Alfred impatiently. "That's what I'm trying to find out." "Do you reckon he's run away?" asked Stella thoughtlessly. "No," she answered sternly. "He ain't no sneak." The father turned to Fred Mims, one of the survivors, and asked him where John was and how the bridge had been destroyed. "You see," said Mims, "when that terrible wind come up we was out about the middle of the river. Some of us was on the bridge, some on the derrick. The wind blowed so hard we could scarcely stand, and Mr. Hill told us to set down for a spell. He's afraid some of us might go overboard. Then all of a sudden the lights went out. Guess the wires was blown down. We was all scared to move for slipping overboard. Then that rain commenced, and I never seen such a downpour since the flood. We sat there and someone begins to pray. Lord, how we did pray to be spared. Then somebody raised a song and we sung, you hear me? We sung from the bottom of our hearts till daybreak. When the first light come, we couldn't see nothing but fog everywhere. You couldn't tell which was water and which was land, but when the sun come up, that fog begun to lift and we could see the water. That fog was so thick and heavy that it was hugging the river like a winding sheet. And when it rose, we saw that river had rose way up during the rain. My God, Alf, it was running so high it nearly touched the span of the bridge. And red as blood? So much clay, you know, from the land she done overflowed. Coming downstream as fast as a press train was 3 big pine trees. The first one wasn't 40 feet from us, and there wasn't no chance to do nothing but pray. The first one struck us and shook the whole works, and before it could stop shaking, the other 2 hit us, and down we went. I thought I'd never see home again. But Mims, where's John? I ain't seen him, Alf, since the log struck us. Maybe he swum ashore, maybe they picked him up. What's that floating way down the river? Alfred shaded his eyes with his gnarled brown hand and gazed out into the stream. Sure enough, there was a man floating on a piece of timber. He lay prone upon his back. His arms were outstretched, and the water washed over his brogans, but his feet were lifted out of the water whenever the timber was buoyed up by the stream. His blue overalls were nearly torn from his body. A heavy piece of steel or timber had struck him in falling, for his left side was laid open by the thrust. A great jagged hole wherein the double fists of a man might be thrust could plainly be seen from the shore. The man was John Redding. Everyone seemed to see him at once. Stella fell to the wet earth in a faint. Maddie clung to her husband's arm, weeping hysterically. Alfred stood very erect with his wife clinging tearfully to him, but he said nothing. A single tear hung on his lashes for a time, then trickled slowly down his wrinkled cheek. "Alf!" screamed Maddie. "There's our son! I knowed when I heard that owl last night." "I see him, Maddie," returned her husband softly. "How's you standing there? Go get my boy!" The men were manning a boat to rescue the remains of John Redding when Alfred spoke again. "My poor boy. His dreams never come true." "Alf!" complained Maddie. "Why don't you hurry and get my boy? Don't you see he's floating off?" Her husband paid her no attention but addressed himself to the rescue party. "Y'all stop. Leave my boy to go on. Don't stop him. Don't bring him back for that old tree to grin at. Leave him to go on. He wants to go. I'm happy 'cause this morning my boy is going to sea. He's going to sea. Out on the bosom of the river, bobbing up and down as if waving goodbye, piloting his little craft on the shining river road, John Redding floated away toward Jacksonville, the sea, the wide world, at last.